Hello, my name is Patrick Usher, and in this video I'm going to be discussing my memories of POTS recovery. In more detail, I have a video already on this channel which I made back in November 2015 at the 6-month point of my recovery from POTS after following the 6-month limbic system rehabilitation program, which is the Dynamic Neural Retraining System. But I thought I'd go into more detail and talk about how it was in more specific terms, and the ups and downs of recovery and successes along the way. And I thought it would be nice to film this first video talking about those 6 months out in the garden, because it is actually rather extraordinarily sunny today here in Dublin, having been fairly wintry in the last week. So I thought it would be nice and more appropriate when talking about recovery to be outside and in some indication of sun. So, I started the Dynamic Neural Retraining System on May the 11th, 2015. I had been doing it in a kind of not very consistent way for a couple of weeks before that, just doing some of the basic exercises, which had had some noticeable effect, but hadn't kind of made a massive difference. And after my dad and I had travelled from Dublin to England, I had been pretty knocked sideways again by that trip, not as badly as I had been before by the flights I talked about in my earlier videos, Memories of POTS 1, 2 and 3, but certainly I was kind of knocked back a while, and that was very disappointing. So I wasn't in the best way, and I was back to kind of being able to only walk 5 minutes a day. Now, so May the 11th, 2015 was the day I first started the practice, and I got up in the morning and made a cup of tea, because in those days I was still drinking tea. I don't anymore. It's a very bad idea if you have POTS to drink anything with caffeine. But I wasn't drinking coffee, but just I'd have cups of tea, and I went into the living room and I did the practice for the first time. And of course I note here that I can't actually say what the practice involves, because it is copyright of the DNRS, and that's their program and that's for them to teach. I can only talk about my experience with it, and I hope you understand that. But I did that practice, and I did it for an hour, and my whole sensory perception at that moment changed for the rest of the day. I could see everything so clearly. I could see the trees. I could see the subtle shifts in how the wind might move the trees. I could see the light so clearly. Everything, my senses were shot wide open as a result of that first practice. And I remember thinking, this was different. This must be having an effect. This was powerful. This seemed to be speaking to the primitive limbic system in a way that mindfulness couldn't, in a way that CBT couldn't. Not that those things mightn't help, or indeed in some cases be enough, but this was speaking in a very powerful and direct way to a traumatized brain, and it was giving it the opposite of trauma, right? And I remember after that first practice I went into the garden, I sat down, and I just looked at things. I looked at the flowers in detail, I looked at the trees in detail, and I just sat there being sort of bathing, as it were, in the sun, and didn't move for ages, because I was just so deeply peaceful from doing that first practice, and felt like this must make a difference. Now of course I still had plenty of fears. It was only an hour that I'd done it. I had plenty of fears that this was not going to work, or I'd do it all and it wouldn't make a difference. But nevertheless, I had a sense or an inkling of hope that this was something different. And so that first week was a pretty incredible week, actually, because by the end of that week, the continuous release of adrenaline, which had plagued me at a kind of catastrophic level for certainly 3 to 4 months before that, and at a lighter level for about 1.5 years before that, following various traumas, stopped. And this was amazing, because I had picked up already in my research that the autonomic nervous system dysfunction that we talk about in POTS must lead to a fairly continuous release of adrenaline. And it just stopped. The DNRS exercises tricked the brain and lifted the limbic system out of crisis, and they stopped. And that was simply, look at this light here, it doesn't matter. Anyway, and it stopped. And it was an amazing feeling that there was calm. There was no surging release of adrenaline going off in my stomach, no churning. It was just quiet. And that was a sign that something big had happened. So I remember being immensely encouraged by this. And not only that, but as I mentioned, you know, I'd been kind of back down to sort of 5-minute walks after this trip. And on day 8 of the brain rewiring, I was going for a walk, and suddenly my legs were not as heavy as they had been. They were lighter. And this was a wonderful moment. And just for 10 seconds, I ran. And it just felt like the energy was in my legs to do that. And I sprinted for 10 seconds. And I stopped. But I just couldn't believe that this had happened. And then, on the same walk, there's a little hill near this cottage where we were staying. And it's like 3 or 4 minutes to the top of it if you walk up. And I looked at that hill and I thought, I think I can walk up that hill. So I went and I walked up the hill. And that was another amazing moment. And I got to the top of it and I looked around and thought, Janie Mac, did I just walk up that? And I had. And I was stunned, absolutely stunned. And I remember thinking as I walked back home, if this is where I am on day 8, where might I be on day 180? Because already these changes were profound and much greater than any of the other things I'd been trying in terms of exercise, which had helped, diet, which had helped, meditation, which had helped somewhat, getting my mind off things, which had helped somewhat. But these exercises were speaking to a traumatized brain in a way that nothing else ever, it seemed to me, could. So this was very exciting. And then, what would be the next milestone? I'd say that the second week was more disappointing because I went back a little bit. You know, the first week I was really stunned by the progress. Second week was more stressful, I think, and you know, my heart rate was still pretty high and so on, and I think there was a time I went for a walk and I was kind of polaxed afterwards and I had to just lie down for ages and I was exhausted. And you know, that kind of paralysis, exhaustion, I remember going for that walk, then lying down and being unable to move. Right. So that was disappointing, but I stuck with the exercises, of course. Apart from one day I didn't, and then I picked myself back up. That day didn't count, right? That day, those days never count, you know, getting to 180. And but then, on the third week of sticking with it, and I kind of been, you know, really happy with changes up to this point, but also noticing that, you know, I was still feeling kind of, you know, it wasn't really ultimately going to work, and so on. Things might come back, and you know, all the symptoms might rush back. But then on the third week, I woke up one morning and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I was different. I was myself again. You know, the color of my face was different. The timbre of it, that's not the right word, but the whole complexion was me. And before, I was this pale, pasty, thin, gaunt looking person who I didn't really recognize as myself. And suddenly I wasn't that person anymore after 3 weeks. And then somehow it felt harder to contemplate the return of the old Patrick. And pretty much around that 3-week mark, one day I woke up and said, there's a much larger hill near where we were living. And I thought, I'm going to climb that hill today. And that was a 45-minute walk there and back, including up this large, substantial hill which used to be a hill fort. And I went and did it. And I remember I was stunned at myself. I was like, is this my body? Is this really happening? As my legs, carried me up this hill. And I got to the top and I looked around this amazing view of the countryside in Devon in southwest England and just started to cry because I just walked up this bloody hill. And as I say in my other video, there was no one there to share this with, but there were some sheep. So I was like, hey sheep, did you just see what I just did? You've no idea how precious a moment this was. And sheep are really, they don't get it, you know what I mean? You can tell them anything and they're just, it's in one ear and out the other. So anyway, so I was up at the, and I'd done this and it was stunning. And then I felt, gosh, this is the real deal. Now, of course, fears still come back because that's part of limbic system impairment, and they did for a while, for months actually. But the overall trend was continuously upwards. And but there were down days, and there were days where I, even after this amazing 3-week achievement, that I'd have a bad day again, and I'd have to rest more, and my blood pressure might have been a bit all over the place, or whatever, or even if it didn't, it might have felt like it, and I had to rest. And what I learned to do was to trust this ebb and flow. And it is a natural part of recovery that you will go forward and back, sometimes more back, sometimes more forward, sometimes less forward, sometimes less back, or variations and all that. And that's normal. But the main thing is that you keep rewiring, because you get to the point where it's mainly all forward. And that may come after 2 months, it may come after 3 months, it may come after 5 months, it doesn't matter. The point is, there will come a time where you plateau, and then you keep going, and then you reach a new level, and then you plateau, and then you reach a new level, but you're not going back. And so that was a really precious moment when that did eventually come, but it wasn't in the first 2 months. So there would be days when I was exhausted, when I had to take it easy, and that was just the way of it. But everyone has this experience. Everyone. So if this is the case for you, you're doing the DNRS and you're going forward and back and forward and back. Same for everyone. It's normal. It's part of this. Any recovery is like this. I don't know why that's the case, but there's very rare that you see of any, certainly recovery from a limbic system impairment, but most illnesses that aren't something like a virus or whatever, or a flu, where it's all an upward trajectory. It tends to be up and down. So when it's down, that's fine. Lie in bed, do your exercises, and read a comic. It doesn't matter. It's nothing to worry about. If really take that on board. It is nothing to worry about. And even when you go backwards, it's very rare that it's going to be like what it was, before. And normal everyday life is up and down too. Some days you feel great, some days you feel shit. And that's how it goes, and that's normal. So it's nothing to read too much into. You're never going to be 100% super duper in life. No one is, unless there's something wrong with them. Life is not easy, and especially for the sensitive person. So you just have to allow that there's going to be days like that, and it's normal. And just keep plugging away, keep planting seeds of recovery by doing the practices. So my next main milestone during this time was, I went into town on my own. I saw some friends, had lunch out, that kind of thing. which was super and beautiful actually, because I thought that kind of thing wasn't going to be possible. And I also, after about a month, started to be able to tolerate large meals. You know, in my book I talk about the importance of eating as much of the good stuff as possible, but it isn't actually necessarily possible at the beginning. You know, there are various digestive issues that make it quite hard to eat a huge amount. So rather, if that's the case, focus on eating the amounts you can of the good food that you can, assuming that you're not sensitive to the foods in question. If you are, you have to rebuild them in one by one. So after about a month, I started to be able to tolerate eating lots and lots of good food. I would have breakfasts of eggs and homemade bread, and I think I had rashers actually. That's probably not very healthy, but bacon. But anyway, I'd have a lot of protein for breakfast, and then I'd have sort of like lots of fruit as well after breakfast, nuts and things like that, and then healthy lunch, lots of veg, some protein, soup, and then in the afternoon I'd have a smoothie of things like I would boil up spinach and various greens, and add and then cool that down, and then add kind of blackberries and raspberries and banana and coconut milk and avocado and honey and something to make it a bit crunchy. I'd have that in the afternoon, and then in the evening there'd be more food with vegetables and protein and everything. So I ate very well, much better than I do now, although not too bad now, but I ate very well, and started to put on weight. By the end of that 6 months I was, I had a good amount of weight on me in a healthy way. So that was another milestone. Another milestone in relation to food was the suspected mast cell attacks ceased pretty much again after about 3 weeks. I could now eat anything pretty much. I didn't eat sugar, I didn't eat the baddies, not the obvious baddies, but I could eat the obvious goodies without difficulty for the most part. So that was another huge relief. And generally just feeling like my day wasn't going to be a nightmare anymore. I might be tired, I might be occasionally very tired, but it wasn't a question of, am I going to get through this day, because the symptoms are so severe. So I was much more stable, and I started writing some things, playing the piano, a big part of my life, and that kind of thing. Another big milestone was after 7 weeks, when my chemical sensitivity reduced hugely. One day, my sense of smell was pretty much back to normal, about 80% back to normal, and I went into the bathroom, and all of the things that before I would have really smelt, I couldn't smell them. I took off the lids of everything. I was smelling the shaving cream or the toothpaste or whatever it was, and it was normal. Dettol, which is a kind of antiseptic, whatever. But all of these things were suddenly no longer overpowering, and that was extraordinary. And again, that was something the chemical sensitivity was another thing I'd had to put up with quite a lot of invalidation from someone who should remain nameless, who should have known better, and who himself actually is chemically sensitive, rather ironically, but refused to believe this was possible for me. And so I have to say I was pretty alone during this recovery process. Okay, I'm not going into details because too much, because it's complicated to do that. But in a lot of ways, it was a lonely place to be, because I got a lot of invalidation, and I was really the one who had to try and work it all out for myself, and that wasn't easy at all. So the next point I'd like to make, and I've talked about this in other videos, but people may wonder, how much was I doing of the practice, and how did I structure my day? For me, once it was clear that it was working, I decided that I wanted to put in the hours. And for me, the practice was very joyful anyway. So, and once you start doing it, it's not a struggle. It's just the starting of it that's the problem. So I reorganized my life to revolve around the practice, really. So I do it first thing in the morning before breakfast for about an hour, and then I would do it at midday for about 45 minutes, and then in the sort of early, sort of late afternoon but early evening, I do it for another 45 minutes, and then before bed I might do it for 20 minutes. So that was my kind of structure, and I would stick to that unless there was something, someone was visiting or whatever, in which case I'd rearrange, but that was my general daily structure. And the number one thing that really helped with this was removing the internet from my life for this period as much as possible, because the internet is the anti, it sort of doesn't allow you to be disciplined, because you get sucked into one thing after another, and before you know it, you haven't done anything, because the brain likes to go for what's easy, and the internet and its potential rewards, Facebook notifications or news feeds or whatever, are to the brain much more enticing than sitting down for 45 minutes or an hour to do your DNRS practice, which requires effort. But by actually removing it from my life, as I couldn't access the internet, and I very deliberately made this choice, and I would go whole days without it, and on the days that I did have it, I would only be on it for 1 hour, which I looked forward to, because it was fine to be on it sometimes. That actually meant that I had a huge amount of time, and I would much more I was much happier without the internet, and it meant that I'd just get on with doing the practice. And I firmly believe that if you haven't tried this and you're struggling to stick with discipline, give it a go for a few weeks. Cut technology out of your life as much as you can, because it is a time waste. It can give you amazing things, but when used improperly, it's a stressor, and it foggies up your mind, and you need a clear mind when you're doing the practices. And I just found that, if you have your iPhone next to your bed, you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is you'll check your email, you'll check different apps, you'll check the news, you'll check whatever. If you don't have an iPhone, you'll wake up and you might just decide to sit on the side of your bed quietly and do your exercises, your DNRS exercises. Something about not having the option makes that much easier. Don't dismiss this advice. If it is a problem for you to stick with discipline, and if you also tend to look too much at negative POTS websites, which are full of very understandable negativity but not helpful for recovery, then consider following this. So in my case, I just got my dad to set a different password on my computer. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't therefore access it unless he put it in for me, and the rule was I was allowed an hour a day. And he was to take it away from me if I stepped over this, and to be fair to him, he stuck very much with this. And he also changed the password on his computer, so I couldn't get onto that. And that's what I did. I removed willpower from the equation, and I just I changed the environment, and I chucked my smartphone away for the time, and I don't think I really checked it for 6 months. I had another kind of old-fashioned phone which I used during that time, which can't do anything apart from ring or send texts. And that was a real secret to recovery. It's a real secret, and I would thoroughly recommend it to anyone. If there's some way you can engineer it, I have a video on this channel called The Use of Technology During Recovery that gives other tips on this, and it's such an important one. And it also calms down the autonomic nervous system, because this stuff is a real stressor and very addictive, and I still struggle with that, but I'm overall better than I used to be. So that was something. So I put in the hours, and I would say, for those first 2 months, I was doing between 3 to 4 hours a day of the brain rewiring exercises, and that seemed to me like a no-brainer, an absolute no-brainer, because why wouldn't you? That was my feeling. Now, I probably didn't have to do that much. I probably could have done an hour a day and been fine. I've no doubt that would be the case. But I was enjoying the process so much. I found it so emotionally healing anyway. I found it like an answer to trauma at a lot of levels. Not every level. I don't think the DNRS helps with complex post-traumatic stress. I think that requires more standard therapeutic interventions. But at the level of severe trauma, it's the best thing since sliced bread. So I was working on that and just doing it, and I enjoyed that discipline. And once you get into it, once you start to put in the hours that way and divide up the day, then you'd be hard pressed not to continue doing it, because it becomes your way of life. And I want to put it like this. I mean, as I said in my last video, I have at times gone to a Benedictine abbey on the Isle of Wight, a Roman Catholic abbey, although I'm myself an atheist, but I'm very open to different traditions and so on, and I very much appreciate this place and the peace of it. It's called Chore Abbey, Q-U-A-R-R. And the monks there spend 4 hours a day singing the psalms, okay, at set hours, and they get up at 5 a.m. and they start off with a practice for 45 minutes, and then at 7 they have another practice for half an hour, and then at 9 for 15 minutes, and then at 10 o'clock they have mass, and then at 1 o'clock they do another practice, and then at 2:20 they do another practice, and then at 4 o'clock they do another one, and then at 7 o'clock they do another one. And overall they're doing 4 hours of singing every day. Now if they can do that, why on earth can't you or I sit down to do the DNRS exercises? You know, those guys are doing that stuff day in, day out for their whole life. Okay. And the DNRS exercises are less taxing than that. And they are beautiful and soulful and joyful and full of creativity and imagination and beauty. What's not to like about doing that? You know, get into the mindset of saying, yeah, I can do that for 4 hours a day if I want to. Why not? It's your own life. There's nothing stopping you from restructuring that to be possible. Even if you're in a busy family situation, you know, your mum and you got the kids or whatever, you just say, I'm closing the door now and you can't disturb me because it's my time to do my exercises, you know. So if you want to go for more, you know, you can. And I found it very beautiful, actually, this kind of structure, because it was like you go into this deep place of doing the exercises and you emerge with your soul refreshed, and then you have this sort of 2 or 3 hour period where you're not doing the exercises, and then you're snatching time doing other things. You know that there's a discipline coming up that at 12 o'clock or whatever you're going to go back to them, and that makes the interim period more interesting, more exciting, more what's this period of time going to offer me? But then at midday, off you go. The bells are ringing and you get back to doing your practice, and it has that nice way of puncturing the day, structuring it, and it's like I like this analogy. The time when you do the exercises, it's like an in-breath. You know, it's sustaining you. It's you know, I don't know if I believe in the soul or not, but I will say that the DNRS exercises imprint beauty onto the soul. I firmly believe that. I think they speak to the depths of the human spirit, quite apart from their implications for limbic system impairments. I think they speak to the depths of the human spirit, and they imprint beauty onto the soul, and they sustain you, and they bring joy to you. And that's an in-breath. And that in-breath is a preparation then for the out-breath of the next part of your day. So then you go on to the next part of your day, you're doing this, you know, whatever it is, you're seeing people, you're doing household stuff. That's the out-breath. It's active. And then you go back to the in-breath and out-breath, in-breath and out-breath. And that's your life for these 6 months. And the discipline of it is really important, but it's really beautiful, actually. But that would be impossible if I had access to the internet 24/7. Would have been impossible, because you end up getting sucked in. And I think that getting offline is the key difference between someone who feels that they don't have discipline, but actually they would, if only the circumstances were better. And I think technology is wonderful, but also can be insidious. And it can be the real key factor. Get off it and see if that makes, you know, a natural propensity to want to spend more time doing the exercises. So that was the first 2 months. You know, I made a lot of progress. My heart rates came down significantly. For the first while they were still going up by 30 beats per minute, but the overall scores were consistently kind of under 110 upon standing. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, I was starting to get readings, but even a few readings before that. And I tried to stop doing readings because I think that's an over-focus on symptoms. But I was, even before that, even on day 2, actually, I did a reading, and I was going up less than 30 beats per minute. Amazing, really. But it was kind of after about a month, I would say, that I was consistently going up between 20 and 30, rather than 30 plus. So that was amazing. And then the real next big milestone, and this is where I'll end this video for today, was after 2 months, I took a flight, having thought I would never fly again. So my father and my mum had a, well, my dad still lives there, but there's a home in France, in the deep rural countryside. And I thought I was never going to get to go there again because the trip would be too much. But after 2 months of brain rewiring, I got on a flight, and I travelled there, and I arrived, and I was a bit jarred, but I was fine, and the next day I was even finer. So I was able to fly again. What a blessing that was. And the real thing about it was, and I get goosebumps even thinking about it, I flew out from the same airport where I had flown to Fuerteventura in my week of hell, from February of that year. So I had massive traumatic associations with that airport, but I went back, I stayed in the same hotel, it was the same airline, and everything, but it was a different experience. It was calmer, I was a new man, I wasn't half dead, and I took that flight, and I got home. And what a beautiful moment that was. So that was it. So those were the first 2 months, and I remember kind of shortly after I got to France thinking that I kind of had this saying going through my head: I know that I can safely say goodbye to yesterday, by which I meant that shit's not coming back. It can't come back now, because I was feeling so much better, so well, relatively speaking, that I couldn't see how the symptoms could suddenly just return. So I know that I can safely say goodbye to yesterday, and that I was a new person, or in some way restored to my old self. Of course I was still grieving. That process went on for a long time and still ongoing in many ways. But, you know, I always give myself space for that, but I will continue on the exercises. Day in, day out, the breath in, the breath out. Clearing the way. No tech, apart from an hour a day, but ideally even like an hour every other day, frankly. Like, what do you need this stuff for, you know? When there's such beauty around in life, you know? And that's another thing, well, I'll talk more about in the next video, but I think that I really appreciated that, especially much in the 2 months that followed. So these are the first memories of my recovery from POTS. I hope it's helpful. I hope it's been encouraging for you to, you know, wherever you are in your brain rewiring journey. Bear in mind that although, you know, my POTS was pretty debilitating and horrible, it's not the worst. It wasn't the worst. So don't think that you should measure your progress against mine. You should never measure your progress against anyone's progress. It's all individual. But the point is that I'm almost certain. I mean, I am certain. But, you know, I have to qualify these things. But I'll just say I am certain that POTS is caused by limbic system impairment. So it's just a question of putting in the hours and letting time pass. So even if you have very severe POTS, you know, after 2 months you mightn't be in a situation where you can take a flight. But after 4 months you might. Or after 5 months you might. So it's a question of recognizing that it takes time. It takes time, and if you've been a year or two lying in bed, you're not probably going to be in a position to kind of do this kind of things I'm talking about after 2 months so soon. So don't measure your progress against mine or anyone's. Just keep focusing on rewiring the brain and knowing that you are slowly but surely correcting the root, and that slowly but surely your body will heal.